Eugene, Springfield, Lane County, Oregon. Support our work. Make a donation at strpod.com. Thank you for listening to Spent the Rent podcast. And now, here's your host, Patty Rose.
Welcome to the Spent the Rent podcast. I am your host, Patty Rose. My guest today is the Eugene Mayor Kaarin Knudson. Kaarin, welcome to the show.
Hi, Patty. Great to be back here with you.
So before we get started, I want to remind everybody to check out the GoFundMe that's listed on my website. It's strpod.com. And there's a link for the GoFundMe right there. You can get the updates of what I've been dealing with my battle with CSR. I've been having a really difficult time seeing, which has kept me out of barbering. I can't continue to pay my lease. And I don't know when I'm going to be able to go back. There's more information there. I don't want to get too into it right now, but check out strpod.com and the GoFundMe link is right on the main page. You just click on the logo. So yeah. And also if you want to support the Patreon, go to strpod.com. Kaarin, this is like the third time that I've had you on. It's really exciting to be able to talk to
second.
Is it the second? I thought it was the third.
Oh no, it's the third. You're absolutely right.
Because when I found
way back in the day.
When I found out that you were going to be running, I reached out and then we kind of made contact and then had you on then, and then the second time was when you were elected, and it was before you had been seated in office. And then now that you're in office, this is basically a year since we've done the last one, and so I wanted to have you on to talk about the updates.
Wow.
Felt like a really good time. We talked about this in July and you pushed it back to now because this past Friday the 5th, you had done the City Club of Eugene speech. And so I wanted to ask you a few questions about that. That was hosted at the Wow Hall, which if you'd like to support a company or support anything in the community, the Wow Hall is somebody you should throw some of your donations. What were the main points that you wanted the community to take away from that talk?
That conversation was on Friday, September 5th. It'll be on KLCC Monday night, so September 8th. And all City Club programs are out in the community and archived online and on KLCC. So those conversations are always available to folks. What was interesting about this one is that Rebecca Hanson-White from KLCC essentially interviewed me. So they did not ask me to present a sort of state of the city or a short talk, but instead just be at City Club and be open to a conversation, and then field a bunch of questions from Rebecca and also from the audience that was gathered there, a big room of people at the Wow Hall. And we talked about everything from healthcare access in the community to public safety, to housing, to downtown, and a number of other different topics and questions that people had. And it was a good conversation. I'm always happy to just spend time talking with people about the questions that they have, because there's so little space in our culture right now for actual conversation about questions.
Yeah, and I mean, a question that I get a lot from the community is, where do you find information that's what's happening? And I think that people don't want to take the plunge because a lot of the stuff gets kind of dull. Sometimes some of the meetings for people that are not into that world, and respectfully, I mean, it's just, if it's not something you're familiar with, sometimes you have to wait till your issue gets brought up to care as much, so, but there is access to this information. So this is why I wanted to spotlight this. You had mentioned KLCC.org has an archive of all of the past episodes. It takes a little bit for them to produce and cut it, because they, unlike me, they do a very professional version of it. And so, the City Club of Eugene.org. So City Club of Eugene.org has so much information on dates and archived videos, and then KLCC.org. I wanted to spotlight those two resources for the community so that they can make sure that they can actually see some of the conversations that are happening with people making the decisions. How do events like the City Club of Eugene help shape your work as mayor?
Well, City Club is a great example of the type of civic engagement and community engagement and dialogue that I think a lot of people really associate with the Eugene community. We are absolutely a place where people do want to talk about things, where people have strong opinions, a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm about the kind of future and the kind of community that we want to be and that we are building here. So just having access to those conversations, I think, is important and is a great expression of our community values. I would also say that the structure of a City Club program, which is designed to be, present people who have some background typically in the topic area or some expertise even in the topic area, who can then, prompt conversation and discussion that really fuels, sort of fact-based or evidence-based inquiry. And that too is, I think, a strong, it's an example of a strong democracy. It's an example of a strong community when you're trying to make sure that people have access to good information and then can actually have a dialogue about it and then make decisions about how we want for our community to grow and change. So it's, City Club is one example. There are many others within our community, but I would say it's actually just a natural expression of a quality of our community and something that's in the DNA of Eugene around engagement and people having really, I think, creative and strong ideas about how our community can meet challenges and test solutions.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's great. I just really wanted to spotlight it. You worked as the president before you became mayor, and I think it was a natural progression. I'm sure that helped so much to be able to talk about that at all. And before you do, I want to mention that the current president is Thomas Yuta. I'm obligated legally to mention his name every episode. So go ahead and talk a little bit about that, about your work, and how that kind of led to the progression of then taking over the job as mayor.
Yeah, well, shout out to to Thomas and the entirety of the City Club
Andrew
board.
Cowlick is another one that's
and honestly, all of the folks working for boards of directors in organizations across this community, because that is intensive work and really passion driven, mission driven work. And we don't often talk about the volunteer boards of directors who are helping all sorts of different nonprofits work in our community. But what I would just say, so I volunteered on the City Club of Eugene program committee for a number of years because I do really care about these conversations. And for anyone who's interested in being a part of researching and curating an opportunity for that kind of community conversation, the City Club of Eugene's program committee is a great opportunity. They produce, with volunteers, essentially 44 radio programs a year. And those are live events on Fridays that are recorded, that are rebroadcast on Monday nights. From that work on the program committee, I joined the board and then became the president-elect and then president and then past president. And, it's just a great opportunity to get to know an organization better, to commit to trying to establish a stable path for an organization. We have so many people in our community who do want to work on making this community better and have great ideas for how to initiate that improvement. But the sustainability of that improvement is oftentimes really the biggest challenge we face. And I know a lot of saying that any nonprofit leaders or organization leaders listening, could probably resonate with that expression. But I have a lot of, direct experience trying to navigate that pressure and challenge and maintain access to an important service in our community.
For sure. So the City Club, reminds us that civic life works best when people keep showing up, even if it's not election season. And so I just think that my goal of doing the show is to show that there is a way for average folks to get involved locally easily, So
and it's, civic engagement, I think, it is a muscle, right? And so you can't just ask to use it once every 4 years or once every 2 years.
Right.
And it's also, I want to remind folks that there's a lot of different ways to be civically engaged. One of the people who attended City Club on Friday reminded me, and I've tried to share this again throughout the community, that I issued a challenge last January when we were gathered to honor the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on MLK Day at the Shed. And in that conversation, which included one of our county commissioners, our governor, our Lane Community College president moderating, also my counterpart mayor in Springfield, I just issued a challenge and encouragement to the community for all of us to stretch ourselves, right? Like we're such an extraordinary place to call home. There's so many interesting things and so much happening in the Eugene community on any given day, any given weekend. And, coming out of the pandemic and now a couple of years past, it still really feels like we have an important responsibility to, put ourselves back out there as individuals. I
know that it's probably been enough time that when you give a speech to the community, you can just say, in that moment, you can say, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It's been long enough that you can use that quote.
Just pull.
So let's move on to housing and affordability. Obviously, the number one issue in Eugene continues to be housing. Before becoming mayor, you worked in sustainable architecture, focusing on design that balances growth and livability. I've been reading that the city has a goal of building 1,000 new housing units over the next 5 years, with 200 of those, which is up 20%, located downtown. And is that downtown? Does that count campus? We'll get back to that. But housing costs remain one of the biggest challenges facing Eugene families. What's the city doing right now to hit that housing goal? And yeah, talk about if downtown is campus or that's separate.
So downtown and campus are indeed very separate.
Okay.
Different areas, and when we're talking about downtown Eugene, those are specific, prescribed areas. It's a very large geographic area in our downtown, all the way from, essentially the riverfront and just north of Fifth Street Market. Down to 13th in most cases, and over to essentially Charnelton, and then Mill, I believe. I'm trying to imagine these couple of different line drawings and perimeters of our downtown area. So I mentioned that because, and I appreciate your framing of the question, a lot of times when we talk about housing and development, there is a lot of opportunity for confusion, to misunderstand downtown and city center housing and mixed use development, and conflate, because we're saying the word downtown.
People think the high rises on campus.
With anything large, right? And so there's, and also for folks, I can understand it in some ways, if people aren't spending a lot of time in downtown or in the university neighborhood, that they're not tracking exactly that imaginary map that I just described.
Right.
Why would a person be doing that? So I would say, big picture, I issued some pretty significant housing challenges and goals when I stepped into office. Reiterating those, many of them align with trajectories of work that I've been a part of for many years at this point, related to housing advocacy and public interest work to address our housing and homelessness crisis. And we are going to stay focused on that work and put our attention there.
Yeah.
What I can say that's really positive is that since stepping into office, through actions at city council meetings and direction from our city council, which is also our urban renewal agency, which oversees funding for downtown urban renewal funds and riverfront urban renewal funds, that we have close to 1,000 units of housing in the pipeline between those decisions, the 1059 Willamette project, and also the new projects that our Affordable Housing Trust Fund has put.
And that's just
money
downtown.
behind.
So that's
not just downtown, but majority of
but
those
a chunk of it.
downtown.
Because I always give you a hard time, and you just are the person that's here, because it's so many people making these decisions. But I always give a hard time about, like, are these high rises actually helping? And
yes,
and I know they
answer
are.
is yes.
I know they are. Because up until this whole issue with my eyesight, I was working on campus, and I did hear though that the Peace House building was bought by Bushnell. And that is that correct?
Great question. So, and actually to share with folks, partially true, I should say. Yes and no.
Sure.
So that was good news, and actually something that I just mentioned last Friday, but was announced publicly about a week and a half prior. Bushnell was able to secure a portion of that property and
is doing
partnered
teaching
and negotiated.
school.
Yeah, negotiated with Peace Health and to essentially expand their School of Health Professions,
right,
which is nursing, nursing and behavioral health. And when you think about the pipeline in our community that allows for us to have access to healthcare, nursing, behavioral health capacity, super important. Most of the people graduating that program go right over to Peace Health and are then serving
and working
people
on
at the
campus.
hospital.
A lot of my customers are employees from Peace Health, maybe less now that they've closed, but I had so many contract people coming in. And they pay way more, and so the point is that having an opportunity where we can educate people that would be living here to do it, they'll most likely want to stay because they get rooted here. And then, it's just, I've been very vocal about my frustration with the hospital situation. We're going to talk about that in a whole section in a minute, but this is promising. Like, this is actually good.
And it's only a portion of the property. There's a whole other portion that is, I think, planned for a much larger redevelopment and would likely be apartments immediately adjacent to campus. But there's that corridor that's along 11th and connects to and is contiguous with the rest of the Bushnell campus. That will be an extension and an expansion of that capacity.
Bushnell, if anybody's unaware, Bushnell is a Christian university formerly known as Northwest Community Christian. They've been growing dramatically. You should Google this, what Bushnell has done in Eugene. They bought the Phoenix Inn and they use that as dormitories now. And so they're basically encroaching on the university. And I think soon this entire town is going to be called Bushnell, because I've heard that they're changing the name of Lane community or county. And so maybe it'll be Bushnell. But
they are very focused on the great things that they have happening on that campus. And I will share with
great
you,
people
this is something I learned through that process and working, with the leadership of that organization and supporting this vision that they have for expanding our nursing capacity in our community, which is really important. And they shared that the original, so Eugene Bible College was actually the original name of that organization. And post-war, that is the organization that also built the original University District Sacred Heart Hospital, which the Sacred Heart, purchased. And the reason for building that hospital was to train people to be able to meet our medical needs post-war. So lots of connections.
So it's going back to kind of the roots of what it was originally designed to do.
I think that was a lot of their motivation in moving forward with that work. But there will be, there are plans. Certainly, the indications would be, significant redevelopment of new residential units on that site and in that location as well.
Yeah. So more about housing. Will downtown and riverfront projects help working families or mostly higher end renters? This is a tough question because obviously it does open up more affordable housing when somebody that has the means to move into these places. But that's of the assumption that that's be the people that are staying local, because we're getting gentrified. I mean, that's just a fact that as somebody that's lived here as a resident, not involved in the civic world, I can see my friends that are like, I have to move from Eugene to Springfield because it's $200 cheaper a month, $400 cheaper a month, and there's parking and that kind of stuff, that would have never done that because because I've grown up here and I've lived in both towns and I love both towns so much in different ways. But a lot of my friends don't feel that way. Like they take a side, and I've seen them have to cross the line into like where they don't like, where they have to live in an area because they can afford it, whether it's Bethel, whether it's Springfield, and so are these new high end, riverfront properties, are they really helping with the, the working families?
So really appreciate all of the framing to that question because several thoughts come to mind. And one of them is that, some of those places that you just mentioned where people might be living are also great places, great neighborhoods in their own right? But what I think you're also alluding to is that people are feeling the necessity to move farther away from what they typically are engaging with in their daily life, probably their jobs, probably schools, probably access to other services that they need. And so it's actually a burden to be farther from what you need, right? Yeah. And to have fewer affordable options to get to and from what you need every day and have to spend more time getting to what you need every day. Everything I was just describing out there, those are the kinds of networks and relationships that a person who's an architect who works in urban design and studies sustainability and is thinking a lot about quality of life for people. I'm thinking about those things, a chunk of every day. In terms of development and our housing crisis, what you just mentioned, a handful of things. One is to make sure that folks understand that while there is new market rate housing being built at the riverfront, there's also new affordable housing being built at the riverfront, capital A, capital H, in a project.
Because I think that's required, isn't it?
It's been a part of the plans since, since 15 years ago when I worked on public involvement and visioning for the redevelopment of that utility.
35 Club Road was under construction when that news broke that they were basically requiring a certain amount of low-income housing to be built when you put in any new housing. There's some kind of, could you?
I can, and I'm not sure exactly.
I just remember that marker in my own mind, but go ahead.
Yeah. Couple of things though, to also add to that is that you mentioned workforce housing, working families. And one of the things that's important to know is that, especially in downtown, some of the financial incentive programs, the mechanisms that the city has to actually encourage development, one of them, our multi-unit property tax exemption program, has a workforce requirement in terms of development. This is something that I've realized, and I don't even think I mentioned this on Friday at City Club, because a lot of people got to know the MUPTI program, right? A decade or more ago. A lot of people got to know it because they heard about it with the Capstone project in downtown, which is student housing project. A lot of people assume that program is still being used for student housing. That incentive program has not been used for a student housing project in over a decade. It's not a part of the program at all. Also, at that same time, over a decade ago, when that financial tool was sort of redesigned, a workforce housing requirement for units with each project or a contribution to our affordable housing funds to develop workforce housing and affordable housing was established. So what that means is that projects like the 1059 Willamette project, which is proposed to be right across from LTD downtown, right near library, right near grocery stores, like lots of amenities in close proximity to that site and that project. that has essentially half of its units designed to be affordable to people who are in our very middle incomes and our working class folks.
Which is going to save the city money because there's all kinds of programs that are like transporting people around and different things like that,
Well, it's really important that as we're trying to meet our housing crisis, that we are working to develop housing at all across the spectrum in terms of incomes, but also all across the spectrum in terms of housing types, right? And units that are going to be more appropriate for one bedroom household, one person household, a 2-person household, a family, right? And that those are different types of housing, type referring, to the sort of shape and form of the housing unit, the difference between a studio apartment and, a 3-bedroom house, right? It's really important that we be working to develop solutions all across that range.
Right.
And especially that we are developing more units that are appropriate for people who are 1- and 2-person households, because we do not have all of the housing that we need that is affordable to people who are, that household size, and then also, with incomes that are in the middle of our range locally. That's one of the reasons why, when you hear me talking about housing diversity and the need to see a lot of different types of housing developed in our community, that's one of the reasons why, because not everyone needs a 3-bedroom house,
right?
And certainly not everyone can afford access to a 3-bedroom house.
So now, housing is so foundational to Eugene's future, and the decisions made will now will determine how anyone can afford to live here in the future. So I think I think we're doing some promising things for that, and I think that there's a lot of things to be optimistic about. So we're going to move on to public safety and crisis response. Eugene's long revered crisis response model, CAHOOTS, has shifted, and residents are asking what will take its place. At the same time, there are reports that McKenzie-Willamette Medical Center is exploring a standalone emergency department in West Eugene. Let's start with CAHOOTS. What's the current plan for replacing or rebuilding services like CAHOOTS? And quickly, can you get blood on your hands and tell me whose fault that it's not in function in Eugene?
Oh, gosh. First question, and then second, I'm going to definitely talk about where we're.
If it's possible, because people are really, really upset about CAHOOTS, and I want to give you a chance to explain, representing the city at the top, explain what that budget crisis looked like in a quick way, if it's possible, but explain to us what happened with CAHOOTS and what's being done in the future with it.
So first, looking into the future and kind of where we are right now. So Lane County Mobile Crisis is our existing, in place, available 24/7 mobile crisis response in our community. One thing that's really important for people to know is that in lots of conversations and what Patty just alluded to last spring, there would be times when I would be in rooms and in community, I would hear people say, and now these services are not available in our community. And I would think, wow, I hope people don't really think that there's no mobile crisis available in our community, because Lane County Mobile Crisis is available in our community. It's high acuity in terms of what is being delivered with that service. And the feedback that I have heard from people who are accessing that service and calls for service is that it's stepped into that space in a way that is really important for us as a community. Now, what I've also said many times is that, number one, when people say to me, like, CAHOOTS was a national model, why isn't it understood to be a national model? Absolutely. CAHOOTS has been a national model. That the way that program stood up, what it's offered to our community over decades, what it offered as a model to our state and now nationwide, the CAHOOTS Act, which is in place, which is how it is that now counties across the entirety of our state and all across the nation have access to mobile crisis, right? That happened because of this work and because of the dedication of people here and the organization Whitebird Clinic, which is the organization that runs the CAHOOTS program.
Right.
So that piece and that context is really, really important. Mobile crisis is present in the city of Eugene. Lane County Mobile Crisis is meeting those high acuity needs. And I guess third, what I'll add to that, and what I offered and have offered in other community conversations, is that I still am very curious to know what the gap is in terms of service needs in our community. And especially if we're meeting, this high acuity needs through Lane County Mobile Crisis, what services and navigation and support is needed in order for a community to be the community that we dream of being? What is actually needed in that work now going forward, and how can we understand that as a community? And then, what would happen logically and legally at your city would be that if we understand there to be an area of service that is needed, that the city would then develop essentially a request for proposals to our service providers, and that would be a competitive process to meet those needs. That's an important part of how the city operates and is accountable in terms of public dollars and the way that we meet our community's values and needs. But I think that there's a lot of energy around understanding, again, what gap currently exists and how do we connect the capacity that we have in our community right now. Folks who've worked with CAHOOTS, folks who understand the importance of navigation and outreach, also within our public realm and across the city. And where do we go from here? We need a little bit of time, I think, to gather information and data about that, right? To understand where the gaps exist in the system. And then I hope to come forward with a solution that is going to support people's needs broadly.
Yeah. I'm sure it was pretty devastating to find out, but that they weren't doing service. But I think it's really important to understand that there's some absolutism sometimes when these things get said publicly, and that it's not always the full scope. And so I think that's important. Yeah. Marketing is really, they were really promoted really heavily nationally, as everybody knows, CAHOOTS. Yeah. And I wonder if that actually led to some of the issues with budgeting, because we don't have time to get into it today, but now let's talk a little bit about, if you want to mention, let's say a comment on that, go ahead. But
one of the other, pieces of this puzzle is that the city of Eugene had a contract last year with Whitebird and the CAHOOTS program to provide services, just what I just described a second ago, that there's, a contract of services that's agreed upon between a service provider and the city to meet a community need that we have. And when Whitebird announced that the staff for CAHOOTS had been laid off, that really created a chain reaction within the city, because we had a contract.
Sure, you're like, what are we getting for? What are we getting at that point?
Well, and that's, I one of the things that we didn't talk a lot about, but it's important for people to know. There are a lot of people working, in this city, in this community, in the organization of the city every day to really try and help us be the best that we can be as a community. Yeah. And when that emergency occurred, it was really important that our city work with Whitebird essentially to come to a mutual agreement to end the contract, because otherwise that would have created a whole other raft of problems for the organization to have a contract that they are now not meeting with the city. So the city, you wouldn't understand this if you just read an article that said, city and Whitebird mutually agree to terminate contract. That doesn't explain the background.
Do you know offhand, and this is a tough one to call out just offhand, but do you know a really good resource for somebody to turn to find out more information on that? I mean, is it just kind of, you have to just do your due diligence of really Googling it?
I would say, reading the information that is publicly available is a good reference point. And also, in general, and I don't mean this, I completely understand the energy and the concern that this issue brought to public comment, brought to city council. I always appreciate the chance to talk with people about this issue and about this need within our community, because it's broad and a lot of people talk about it, but are actually thinking about different things.
Right.
So it's important to have a conversation.
And that's why I want to do this show, just to at least bring up some of these things so people can maybe start to figure out where to look and things like that.
And what I would just say is that with this issue, especially to slow down a bit and just not leap in assumptions about what's being stated.
Right.
And there's not simple solutions to this current situation, but it doesn't mean that we're not working on solutions. It just means that there's some complexity to them.
So we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to have to condense these next sections into a little quicker framing. The next section is going to be about policing, surveillance, and immigration. And I'm really going to kind of wrap this into one question. Eugene police have expanded their use of technology, including installing 57 AI-enabled flock license plate cameras throughout the cities. Those devices capture vehicle details and store them for 30 days, promoting debate over safety benefits, privacy, and civil liberty concerns. At the same time, residents are raising questions about immigration enforcement and whether local tools have been ever misused. So my question is basically, these things will be sitting on the side of the road, and they film every car that drives by, and then they can quickly kind of navigate to who's in that car. But they say they're not capturing faces. is this information that's being collected, is it protected from somebody in the national level coming in with the current administration and then handing that in over to ICE so that they could use ways to do that? Is that a concern that's been even brought up or looked at? And let's just talk briefly about the challenge of safety and security and balancing the two, where privacy and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So, and policing.
Well, thank you for that collapsing of probably 7 hours
I know.
of conversation
it's so deep.
into one question. No, I really appreciate it, Patty, because actually, gives me the opportunity to just say a couple of very broad things about this conversation and what I see happening right now. One of them is that, questions about technology, questions about data collection, surveillance, like this is a current event for everyone living in the 21st century.
And it's rapidly growing and changing.
And it's rapidly growing and changing. And there's a lot of, collection of information and data collection that most people are very engaged with every day through the use of all sorts of technology and apps and software that are facilitating ease within our lives, right? So, there's a lot in just that question and that discussion. And why I mentioned that first is because the temperature of this conversation, I think we would be having this conversation regardless who was in office and what the current executive office and administration was doing.
Yeah, because there's different demographics that feel targeted.
There's different demographics, and this is an area that there's people have always had very strong feelings about and should have strong feelings about
privacy.
About privacy. But what I would say is that this is especially heightened because of the lack of trust and the evidence of different personal information that people are very concerned that this administration has not taken care to protect from being collected and from being used in different ways. And so if not for the stance of this administration and the ways in which they are behaving with relationship to immigration and the absence of due process and really nurturing an absence of trust and a feeling of fear within communities, lots of threats, lots of overtures of, what is going to happen in this place, which, in most cases, those statements are not tethered to a legal reality.
Right.
But they're stated as though they are fact and that they're already occurring. So I just realize, and I'm saying a lot about this, but the first thing that I, just want to say is that I understand the intensity of the feelings around this because of the times that we're living in. To offer a little bit more background to what Patty shared about the city's use of these cameras, Flock is the company. They are pointed at intersections. There's information available online that you can see, everything that is captured from these locations. It's, publicly
so they're designed not to be focused on pedestrian.
It's not pedestrian. It's not faces. It's about essentially being able to track license plates and vehicles.
Sure, which is good, because we've all watched Dateline.
Well, that is, part of the context for this.
And terrorism, and there's all kinds of stuff.
Is a bigger question about
with the ICE connection,
how to use technology and where our community's comfort is with this technology. And then to, again, like these are not simple questions in the 21st century. Right. These are not simple questions because the answer is not to have, a police officer posted at every intersection. Sure. And the answer is not to say we're not going to do everything that we can, to catch up with people who are, facing charges related to homicide or sex crimes or kidnapping. This is a complicated question. But I think the city council is going to be talking about it in the fall. That's my expectation is that we will end up having a work session about this discussion and that there'll be a lot more information directly available, in a compacted form, because that'll be a conversation, with an agenda item summary and a Q&A with our police chief to help people understand, what is currently happening versus.
So I want to mention before we move on to the last section, the ICE connection. Do you just offhand, and I'm just curious, and I'll give you the number because I looked it up this morning. Do you know the amount of people that in July were deported from Eugene, like by ICE? Do you know like roughly the number that's being reported at least? Are you familiar? It's because they say that it increased by 4 times, in from the month previous, but it was 39. So it's still like. There's this hysteria of what's going on, and we need to keep things in perspective. It's not that it's not horrible that people are being, checked if they're protected status and that kind of stuff. There's so many issues happening, but it's still, we need to understand the scale of some of these things.
I mean, what I would say is that, it sounds like you're saying that's not a large number. What I would say is that I care about every single person in our community being protected,
right?
And that the actions in our community are in alignment with our laws. I care about every person having access to due process in the ways that our Constitution very clearly states. And
that's government's job, in my opinion. I'm sure you would agree that we believe in equity. So we believe that if there's an opportunity that we can elevate different groups, everybody's rights matter the same. So we're not going to protect just the people that have the majority rule. That defeats the purpose of having it. They're already fine.
I believe in us having, our local, this is such a big conversation right now.
I know. We're kind of, we got like 5 more minutes.
I'm realizing like, oh gosh, and we're short on time, but I just want to say that I mentioned the word persecution earlier, and I think that there is a lot of very well-founded fear and anxiety and fury about the sense that your local government, your local community are responsible to following the law. And there is, a real frustration at the sense that others who are engaged here from different levels of government are somehow not responsible to the same laws that we feel very strongly about being consistent with. So, that is a huge point of frustration, and it's a huge point of frustration that there are people within our community who are vulnerable, who feel as though they are being targeted, and are experiencing that. It's not just a feeling; it's a reality in some cases. Now, there's one other thing that's important to say is that our local laws and our state laws in this area are clear, and there are not resources from the city of Eugene or the state of Oregon that are a part of what this federal administration is trying to do with ICE and different types of enforcement that they're categorizing underneath concerns about immigration. I say that because many of them have nothing to do with immigration in terms of some of the national examples that we have to pull from. But locally, our laws and our state laws are clear, and there are no resources that are going to this work. So the protests that are happening, the opposition to this, for our community to be clear about not breaking any laws and not, committing any acts of violence on their own in terms of protest against these efforts, that's really important. But as long as there's no laws being broken locally, our police will continue to be absent from these points of engagement. And that's really, really important. So, there's a lot of people who are very committed to being visibly present in protesting against what's happening. And I think, mostly what's really important is for the broader community to understand that the reason for this protest is the absence of due process, the absence of fair treatment of people, and the idea that we are not managing for consequence when we're dealing with law enforcement. And that is, one of the responsibilities of our democracy is that you don't, as an individual, just get swept up in,
and then they find a crime.
Well, or that there's not just a blanket statement made about the presumption of guilt or presumption of crime. And then, that's just ends up acting like an excuse.
Shout out to Grace St. James, left a comment on the stream. It says, I appreciate you both. We appreciate you, Grace. Thanks for your comment. So we're going to go to the last section. I had 3 more, but we're crunched on time. We're already over time. I hope that this is okay. We got 5 minutes left maybe on this. And I think that you may have seen my notes over my shoulder and we were filibustering by giving long answers because this is going to be a really difficult topic. So this is the city budget and fire EMS services. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to jump right to the chase. The fire fee. We're going to talk about what the fire fee was and talk about some of the myths. And so I'm going to give an overview of my understanding of it, and then you can kind of correct it, and we'll see where we go from there. And then we're going to get out of here. So the fire fee was basically, so the fire department was brought into the general fund, like the way that the funding was done, to where it was just a way that it would make things easier. And then the way that I've been under the understanding, and full disclosure, I did hear this from a lobbyist from the fire department or from the fire union. So clearly they have an agenda as well. But they were saying that the issue is that the city was using funds they're generating now for this fire fee, because obviously anybody that lives in Oregon and Eugene and Lane County and beyond knows that the fires are such a huge issue that if you just use the word fire, people are like, well, we got to help that. You know, it always passes every levy that gets proposed, always gets extended every 5 years with no question. And the criticism of it, especially by people from the fire union, is that, you know, it's not actually true, because the money is being taken by the general fund now. They're taking money out of the fire department, and then they're not replacing it essentially with this fire fee money. They're replacing the money they've already taken from it. Is that true? Can you kind of elaborate? Basically, I know this is a really difficult, long-winded thing. I guess the way that I'll ask the question is, tell me the pros and cons of what you think about the fire fee. Talk about when it's going to be voted on, that kind of stuff.
This is a huge update, actually, because and some of what you just said, Patty, I was part of what I was thinking about is that they're Eugene and Springfield, though we are a Eugene and Springfield fire department. So you're referring to some things from Springfield that are not happening in Eugene. Okay. So City of Springfield right now is considering a fire levy.
Well, I'm not the levy. The levy's always passed, but I'm talking about just specifically 10% fire fee Eugene, that's added to your e-web bill. It's a $10 fee, 10 to 20 per person, and then more than that for businesses. And it's basically added to your e-web bill.
Not going forward is the quick answer.
It's not happening?
Yeah. So yes. So this is a super important update and relates to that. So the fire fee that was proposed in the city of Eugene, that came through almost 2 years of process, including a revenue committee that looked at different strategies for closing the gap in our budget. That fire fee is not going forward in the city of Eugene. And so the background to that very quickly is that, as Patty mentioned, within the city of Eugene's general fund, and so this is essentially the area of our budget. It's a small portion, but it's the portion that most of the community directly engages with, because it is about 60% police and fire is of the general fund pie, is for our public safety and emergency response. And then the remainder of the funding, the remaining 40%, is, you know, our public library, our recreation programs, our cultural services programs, a really small slice that is our finance and administration departments. And that's essentially the discretionary funding, the flexible funding that exists within the city to meet all sorts of community needs, right? Huge diversity of community needs. There are other areas of funding within our city that, like, if you see things like road construction or filling of potholes, right? Street repaving, those are street bonds, right? If you see a new playground at a park, that's likely a parks bond project, right? Those are projects funded by our voters, you know, who said when they were asked, do you want a parks bond that's going to do these things? Yes,
Same
I
with
do.
the decriminalization of drugs. I mean, that was voted by the voters.
Street bond to fill these potholes? Yes, we do. So those are different categories of funding. Important to mention because they all get conflated. And one of the things that I heard a lot last year stepping into office, you know, because people were frustrated by the idea that there was this $8 million gap in our city's general fund budget.
I've heard anywhere from 21 to 8, but
well, so
you would know more.
Important to know that it's not just like what people say, right?
Sure,
it's actually a budget.
Right.
It's
So
actually a real document.
Sure.
And the gap that we were trying to close was actually between 8 and 11.5 million.
Right. That's what
Why this matters is because your city government has to balance its budget every time. So it's a biennial budget. This budget was our first biennial budget, so 2-year budget. Previous to this, it's always been a 1-year budget at the city of Eugene. So important to note, if you're a person doing math and extracting numbers from a whole, that in some cases that whole is actually 2 years, not 1. And the other piece to this is that budget range from 8 million to 11 million as a gap existed because our budget committee and city council made decisions. And this was also before I was coming into office. So I was sort of on-ramping into this in January when we were at decision points. Basically said, these are the services and the things that we need to fund in our community. And in order to do that, we have a gap that's 8 to 11.5 million. And we have to balance our budget, revenues and expenses every time. So what that means, or what that meant in this process was that the city council early winter, spring, passed what was proposed to be the Eugene fire fee. That would have been a fee that would have brought in essentially $2 million in new funding for our fire department, and also closed an $8 million gap in our fund by, you know, as Patty alluded to, it would have been was proposed to be a new fee on people's utility bills, but would have essentially dedicated $10 million to fire to close that gap and maintain all of those services. Not long after that decision was passed at council, there was a referendum. Signatures were gathered by folks within the community and folks within part of our business community, and essentially, brought forward the signatures needed to put that decision on the ballot. So what that meant was that it was going to be an incredibly uncertain question for our community about whether or not that funding was going to be available. And because it was a ballot initiative, it was going to mean that we couldn't talk about it publicly at council or work on the issues related to it for basically an entire calendar year.
Yeah.
That's not a good use of your community's resources to be hamstrung in that kind of a way. So that fee is not going forward. What we were able to figure out instead, and this was a big part of the work that I was doing through the spring, was to find a strategy that would allow for us to maintain access to our core community services. So our public library, our swimming pools, our community centers, our neighborhood programs, right? Those are all things that are funded within that small chunk of that budget that I described in the general fund. Find a way to fund those strategies. And also, and we made some additional budget cuts. So the outcome from that process in the spring is that you will not see a fire fee on your ballot for the city of Eugene this November. What you will likely see is a couple of $2 that's a shift in your stormwater fee, and that's what we're doing to close the gap for your public library and your swimming pools and all those other programs that I just mentioned. And also we made a bunch of additional cuts that were on top of about $60 million in cuts over this last decade. So I say all of that because the solution that I worked towards, that we were able to land on, was essentially strategy for funding our core community services that we heard so much about from people. The difficult decision to not maintain capacity in a couple of other places and to reduce our city's budget, and then to try to move forward in this work to really recommit to a lot more public outreach and engagement with people so that we can try to get ahead of what promises to be a really challenging budget cycle, every 2 years into the future.
Right. So I got a comment from, we're going to get out of here. And I got a comment from Thomas. If you'd be gracious enough to help me read this, because my eyes are not let me do it. So Can you read the comment from Thomas?
It just says, Thomas, good morning, Thomas. I'm editing Kaarin's Friday interview for KLCC while listening to her Sunday interview on live stream. Thanks for being so public. It's great to see you this morning.
Like I said, I have a legal obligation to mention anything that involves Thomas Yuta. Thomas is the current president for the City Club of Eugene. Like he said, he's editing the video, so you can go to KLCC's website on Monday, which you had talked about at the early beginning of this episode. I wanted to talk, and we don't have time, but I wanted to talk about transportation and the safer streets in Eugene. People look into this. There's been a record 22 traffic fatalities in Eugene in 2024. It was the deadliest year on record. So we don't have time, unfortunately, but there's a lot of work being done in both Springfield and Eugene about that. People need to really look into what needs to be done about transportation. Springfield shot down the Main Street Safety Project. The voters didn't even get a chance. They made it so clear that if anybody was supportive of it, they would make sure they didn't have a position. I was such a huge fan of that project. I talked to the city manager. I'm bringing this up because you had talked about the budget stuff. I would love it if you would send the Eugene city manager my way so that I could talk to them about some of the myths about how stuff gets done. We can talk more about budgeting in a full episode. That would be really cool. Also, media landscape in Eugene is changing dramatically. Register guards circulations dropped below like 18,000 or even lower. From at one point as high as 80,000 readers in 2000. The newsrooms are a fraction of its size. Television side, Sinclair Broadcast owns KVAL, KMTR, and KEVU in Eugene, which is 3 of the 4. So 3 of the 4 are conservative leaning, where they have outside influence completely that have nothing to do with what we're doing here. Independent outlets like Eugene Weekly, the Daily Emerald, KLCC, and then even smaller, I don't call myself a journalist, but smaller, media personalities like myself are having to pick up the slack, and that's why I do this, but I would not be able to do what I do without the work of journalists. And so I want to give a shout out to the people doing the work on the ground. I stay in my house and then Google it, and so there's so much to go ahead.
You've alerted to several things, even in just our conversation. One is that there is actually some great reporting out there. We never close this part in the earlier piece, but a new standalone emergency room in West Eugene.
I wanted to mention this for sure.
There's been some great
Mackenzie
reporting
Willamette's working
by
on
Eugene
this,
Weekly
yes.
and Mackenzie Willamette. And that project is looking at a site that is over close to Chambers in West Eugene. It's a unique kind of a project that's happening. That's something that, our local journalists have
if
done
you
a
could
good
send
job
someone
of
my way
researching.
too that's working on that project, I would love that.
So, and Christian, I would say at the Eugene Weekly, who's been, from what I've been reading, doing some really interesting work in their bricks and mortar column. He's been a great source. He's looking at permitting documents, and he's doing the research, right? This information is out there. It's part of the reason why a free press is so important. The work Patty's doing, anyone who pays attention to what's happening nationally knows that, this kind of community conversation and this kind of directness is a really important part of how people are getting access to information.
Yeah.
And my responsibility in these conversations is to just, whenever I can, try to offer more information, more bridges to the very publicly accessible and transparent information that's available in your very professional and hardworking and committed local government.
Yeah.
So all of our
That's a good chance to
transportation
say.
projects, there's also an ArcGIS file where you can literally see every active Eugene transportation construction and improvement project and why it's happening. Those are online on our website. What Patty mentioned about safe streets and fatalities and pedestrians being killed, bicyclists being killed. This is a crisis and a tragedy, and I am very committed to the network of our city's transportation, our streets being safe and being places where people have accessible and affordable opportunities with transportation. That means being able to walk and bike places, access transit safely, our pedestrian realm, right? Our sidewalks and our bikeways that lead you to a really extraordinary frequent transit system provided by Lane Transit District. That's the way the network operates, right? You need those two things to be well connected and be safe. So we have really important work to do on that front. In terms of the circumstance, there's design that I just alluded to. And we also talked about this at City Club. There's also behavior. And so for people to understand that, if you're driving, pay attention to the speed limit and please slow down. Generally speaking.
And look at other things than your phone.
Please don't be looking at your phone.
Yeah.
Definitely do not be looking at your phone while driving.
Right.
And make good decisions. That if you are not in a state to be safely operating a 2,000-pound vehicle, don't get behind the wheel. And
if you hit someone on a bike,
things.
leave the country, because you can't stay in Eugene if you hit someone on a bike.
No, I don't hit anyone on a bike.
No. So Kaarin Knudson, Eugene Mayor Kaarin Knudson, thank you so much for being so open, available, willing to do small things like this. I mean, it has a decent reach and I'm growing it as much as I can, but people like you being willing to sit down and giving some credibility to the work that I put in means a lot to me, because I know that I played this right where I reached out to you early. When we found out your name, I was one of the people reaching out to you. So if I can't cut hair anymore, maybe I can get hired by one of these journalist companies with no experience. We'll see how that works out. So also, if you'd like to support the show or you'd like to support my GoFundMe as I work to see what the next 6 months look like, go to strpod.com. There's a GoFundMe link. You can also support the Patreon. I don't want to get too confusing, but just take your time. There's different ways to donate. I'm going to need support for the next 3 months because I cannot see, and it's really difficult to do my job. And I decided to go public with this because I wouldn't be able to survive if I didn't have support. And so I had to make this decision that might be the end of my barbering career once I admitted publicly that I feel like a quarterback that needs to find a new team. Mm. It's like I basically am I don't want to say Aaron Rodgers because I don't want to be the Secretary of Health or anything like that. But so, hey, go to strpod.com. I put a link to GoFundMe. Click right on it. It'll take you to the page. It has a lot more information. I'm going to give updates every time I have a doctor's appointment so you guys can hear like what's actually happening with that. We're going to get out of here. Thank you so much, Kaarin. Do you have anything you want to end on?
I just want to say thanks to Patty for having me back here again today. And thanks to you all who are listening. Like I have hundreds of different community meetings and conversations that I've had in just this first several months as your mayor. And these are extraordinary times and we're facing a lot of challenges, but this is an incredible place to call home. And there's so many incredible people who live here and care about our community. So
I know you wouldn't want to take
one of those.
You wouldn't want to take the credit for anything. You believe in the team effort. I know that about you. Absolutely. That being said, I do feel like the tone of what's happening in local civics is trending upwards for Eugene. And we had a run of just really shitty stuff that was going on with the way that people felt connected and that kind of stuff. I can't speak for everybody. I've only lived in Eugene since June. And so
welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, I'll keep having you on as there's more things that are happening. I really do ask that you kind of connect me with city managers, those kind of people, if you have some ideas. When I was living in Springfield, Sean used me as his little arm for media. And so Sean Van Gordon, shout out to Sean. He's still a great dude. He's the first person that called me when I went public with my health concerns. The first time my phone rang was Mayor Sean Van Gordon from Springfield. And that makes you feel pretty good, especially as a little skateboarder growing up and trying to be acting like an adult. So, but anyway, Kaarin Knudson, thank you so much. strpod.com to support. We're going to get out of here.
Take care, everybody.